Our next story comes from Marcas Mac, and I've been reading Marcus's poetry for a number of years. Marianne gave me a gift of one of your books
Oh,
very joyously a few years back. And so it's really great to be in the same Zoom room as you, Marcus. So
and with
work away with
you.
your story. Work away with your story, and I look forward to hearing it. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Gormaile Mahagat. Um, okay, I'm just gonna read this out, and this is what I prepared, and it's some diaspora memoir. I was born into the Irish diaspora community in Yorkshire with a grandparent on each side of the family born in Ireland and emigrating as young people. A lot is said of Irish immigration in North America, and over the end of the 20th century, it's been interesting to see how Irish American cultures have travelled back across the Atlantic with the expansion of the media and the arts. It would be fair to say that the Irish diaspora experience is dominated by narratives of North American origin, but less is said about the experiences of those who made a home after travelling eastward across the water. The relationship between the British colonial state and the still new Irish Republic, coupled with the history of the North, means that the telling of these stories is not always straightforward. Much of it is still bound to the oral tradition, the relating of personal histories to descendants. When I was growing up, these stories were still very much alive amongst our generation. As I went to a Catholic school, many of my friends had an Irish parent or grandparents. Our upbringings were similar: Mass on Sunday, First Communion, Kayleys on St. Patrick's Day. That was the one day of the year we could talk about this aspect of our identity. At other times, it was met with misunderstanding from our peers. A friend and I were once asked, "Why do you want to be Irish?" And we didn't know how to answer. For us, we just were. There was never a point of conflict with our regional Yorkshire identities or other national identities. A British passport never negated it. It was not until I was in my teens that I realised that for my grandparents, this might not have been easy. My grandmother, Margaret, born into a Protestant family in Dublin, had lost her accent entirely. She was fond of the finer things in life and was referred to as the Duchess in the village. This was quite funny to us, knowing that she'd been born into a working class family who occupied rooms in St Mary's Road. Her grandfather had been a bricklayer, and we have very little information about him because he's one of thousands of John Kellys. She was very closed off about her Irish identity. But one story she told us was about being sent a green passport with the creation of the Irish Free State and having to make the choice to sacrifice it in favour of a blue one. This was, of course, the era of no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Having moved to Huddersfield, a West Yorkshire mill town, as a child, one of the stories she told us was of being heckled by builders on her way to the local church school. They'd picked up on her accent and were hurling anti-Irish abuse at her. It made sense to me why she would have changed her accent purposefully or otherwise. Upon marriage, she'd reverted to the name on her birth certificate, Margaret, named after her grandmother. In the family, she was still referred to as Rita, which she always hated, but with an aunt called Maggie and a cousin called Peggy, a third diminutive had to be found. In choosing a different accent and a name, she'd chosen to assimilate into British culture for her own well-being. Both of my Irish grandparents were children of sergeant majors in Irish regiments of the British Army. My grandmother's father, John George Kelly, in the Irish Guards. My maternal great-grandfather was in the Royal Munster Fusiliers, the born in Derbyshire. It was because of this that after the First World War, they were both able to find employment in the market towns of West Yorkshire, presiding over the drill holes there. So my grandmother was brought up in Huddersfield, and my grandfather, Jack Spencer, in Skipton. My granddad's mother was called Ellen Cuneen and was born in a small fishing village called Quilty near Spanish Point on the west coast of Clare. Her eldest brother, Patrick, had been amongst the Quilty Rescuers, a group of fishermen who sailed out in a torrential storm in their coracles to save the French seamen of the Léon XIII from drowning. The French government honoured them with a medal each and paid for the building of a new church, the Star of the Sea, where the bell from the ship is still exhibited, alongside their names painted on the ceiling of the church in Irish. Patrick, like four of his five brothers, emigrated to Bradford in McKean County, Pennsylvania. The other, Thomas, followed his sister to Skipton, near Bradford, Yorkshire. The 1901 census tells us that my great grandma was the last in our family to speak the Irish language, as a child at least, making her one of the last speakers of the West Clare dialect, now extinct. Shortly after the census was taken, she moved to Limerick to take a position in a big house as a servant, and it was there she met my great grandfather, Thomas Spencer. They were married in the cathedral there and walked down the aisle under a guard of honour. My grandfather, John Patrick, but known as Jack after her brother, was the second child of three born in Ireland in different locations because of where they were posted with the regiment. First was Harry in Tralee, then Jack in Kinsale, and Maureen in Castlebar. Kevin was born in England upon emigrating. My grandfather told me quite a lot about his place of birth, Charles Fort in Kinsale. He carried through his years a scar on the back of his head, which was the result of boyhood games with his brother, where he fell off the sea wall. But after leaving Ireland as a child, he never returned. When it came to recording his nationality on the census, he chose to be British, much to my mother's concern. He'd adopted a Yorkshire accent too, and spoke of taunts in the playground at St Stephen's in Skipton, where my mum went herself, when the children arrived there with their Cork accents. When I was of age, I wanted to understand my heritage better, and so opted for a combined honours degree in Hispanic and Gaelic studies at Aberdeen, where I would have had the chance to study Gaelic and Irish. And the time came to take my sandwich year abroad. I stuck out for a term in Ireland as well as Spain, and I was pleased to find out that the link was between Aberdeen and University College Cork. I found my experience in Cork to be mixed. I had a great time and made friends amongst the Irish and Erasmus students, but there was always reticence when I talked about my experience of Irishness as part of the diaspora community. I was told on more than one occasion that I was talking like an American, but of course, my family's origins and experiences were more than real to me. My grandparents had experienced prejudice because of their Irishness, but it seemed easier in Ireland to box me off as English and English alone. It made me less complicated to posit me completely as the other, wrapped up in however many hundred years of oppression. As I learned more, the irony was not lost on me. I existed because of that colonial oppression. My great grandmother had always told her granddaughter, my mother, that England had offered her everything: a husband, a home, and four children. Still, I felt like I was being expected to atone. An epiphany came when my parents visited me in Cork and we drove down to Kinsale to see the place where my grandfather had been born. Charles Fort, now a shell after being bombed by the Republican Army, felt very much like a place where humanity, nature, and the elements collided. We were given a guided tour, which took us to what remained of the key sites, and which allowed us silently to join up the dots of my grandfather's stories, being able to put locations to the narrative. Eventually, we came to the infirmary where the group paused. Raising his hand, the guide indicated the maternity ward, an empty casement on the top floor on the right-hand side. My mother took in a sharp intake of breath. Her father had been killed in a car accident shortly before I'd gone up to university, which had hit us all like a bolt out of the blue, despite him being nearly 90 years of age. To her, this was highly significant. She'd been shown her father's place of birth. That's where my dad was born, she said to the guide. The Americans on the tour were bowled over because, of course, to us, our Irishness was not just a distant name on a family tree, but a man who had lived and breathed and brought us up to be who we are. So I'll finish off with a poem that I wrote for my forthcoming fourth collection in Gaelic, and I'll then read the translation, which talks about this. Mahidach the Mavahid. Mar gafan yul fos di turfan taerejen, lent the whole close at a live unyak in an turf. This would have been the maternity ward, Arshe, the whole a glach mahools, a cree and a mach talayakri, nach the voich action heen, a truge, a larach gunchachal. Gassan fiawr ruanya gan bwreg le bris and mare, fianjelle in an saltars dan a closh came and cassan hain. Chamín a ras ga arish, cashmach ragan sachar an ceann, rievach ordian rank and file. Má lábhar iste cúla hín an bearn in a lánachig fan díoch mi torrig a héitim van balla mare sé ri fialagá le bhráhaid. Beside a van a Harry, Magambe Sergeant Major Ahad, Thomas Spencer, Esson, John Patrick, Misha, Mark John, SAE. That was where my dad was born in 1913. Arshúsa a gyfra ha gyr anol Americanach ron coolers. Oh my God, see it tosh fanyar gan da gŵag loine a gref a chyrlich is see it fianish rúchish ear. Maternity for my mother. As the tour guide came to a halt beside the infirmary, he followed the motion of his hand to a window on the right. This would have been the maternity ward, he said. Your eye caught mine, shaken by the echo of history that only we, our three, perceived amidst the remnants of Charles Fort. The blades of grass stirred by the sea breeze, others trampled in the hollow of their footsteps. My mind wound back to a tale related. Marching Rose, his father out front, bellowing his orders, rank and file. My hand on the back of his head, the void healed. I felt the upshot of his fall from the sea wall and his brother's boyhood games. Harry would be a soldier after that, his father, Sergeant Major Thomas Spencer, he, John Patrick, me, Mark John, after him. That was where my dad was born in 1913, you said, causing a sharp intake of American breath, preceding realization, oh my God, that we'd emboldened a line in our family tree, and that and that they had themselves witnessed true heredity.